Welcome to week 4 of Roman and early Christian history. This week we're going to be talking about Carthage, Carnage, and the Roman middle class. As you can see, I have expanded the map somewhat to show all of the Roman world at this point, because I think it's important for us to get a sense of the geographies. You'll have to excuse Greece. It really should be tilted slightly, but this board is hard to erase. So just to orient ourselves a little bit, here's our old friend Italy. Here's Sicily, half owned by Carthage, half influenced by Syracuse, which is a Greek trading colony. Sardinia, Corsica, here's Crete. Down here, Egypt, where most of the grain that the Romans eat will come from. Spain, way up here, Britain, which the Romans do know about at this point. The great geographer Pythias had actually visited Britain before his death in 285 BC. So at the end of the last lecture, we had talked about the fact that Rome had become the ruler of Italy. They still had some trouble with the Gauls in Cisalpine Gaul, but for the most part, the Gauls weren't willing to mess with the Romans, and the Romans were willing to leave the Gauls alone as long as they stayed out of Rome. And that there was a growing issue with the kingdom or the empire of Carthage. So Carthage is also supposedly related to Aeneas. If we go back to that foundational tale of the Romans, when Aeneas was fleeing Troy with his followers, he ended up here in Africa, where he married and had children with Dido, the queen of the Carthaginians, before realizing that he had not yet fulfilled his destiny and going on to look for the place that the gods had told him about, which was Rome on the Tiber. And the whole time that the Romans have been conquering the Italian peninsula and securing their hold there, Carthage had also been expanding. They had expanded towards Egypt, and they had expanded up across the Straits of Gibraltar into Ibernia, or as we call it today, into Spain, and of course Portugal would be this little piece here. And they were traders like the Greeks. Their empire was primarily a trading empire, and they had come to hold about half of the island of Sicily, which, as you know, is very close to the tip of Italy, and so the Romans kept a close eye on what was going on there. And in fact, because of their various alliances with various Greek city-states and also eventually conquest of Greece, they had come into an alliance with the city of Syracuse, which is here at the tip of Greece, and right about where the boot would kick it. The Carthaginians wanted some of that rich trade, and so it was inevitable that they were going to come into conflict with Rome as they sought to influence and take over Syracuse. And that happened at the beginning of the First Punic War. Now, there were a total of 3 Punic Wars. Next week, I'll give you a handout with some of Livy's writing on the history of the Punic Wars, written, of course, later, not at the time, but he's a very capable historian. But the Punic War that everybody's heard about is the second one. The first one kind of ended in a stalemate. It was going to come back again. And when the Carthaginians produced a very able general by the name of Hannibal, who was sent to rule in their colonies in Ibernia. And at the same time, the Romans were seeking to influence these Greek colonies and trading cities here, and indeed to enter into trade in Ibernia as well. There arose a conflict, and the Carthaginians realized that if they were going to be the major players in what we would now call Europe, they were going to have to do something about the Romans, and the Romans realized that they needed to defend their turf. So Hannibal was audacious, and he was brilliant. And at the time that he was leading the Carthaginians, the Romans really didn't have any capable generals, but what they did have was a very capable consul who was willing to look like he did not know what he was doing for the sake of Rome. And his name was Quintus Fabius Maximus Vercosus. He's also sometimes called a cunctator, which means the delayer, because he realized that he could not possibly defeat Hannibal, and in fact that he could not meet Hannibal in battle. And of of course, we've all heard of Hannibal's elephants, and they really were a real issue that Romans, as you know from our discussion last week when we talked about the makeup of the legion, depended on light horsemen for skirmishers, for scouts, for small cavalry charges. And horses are terrified of elephants. In fact, if you know your Kipling, they were still terrified of elephants, and the British Army had trouble with horses being terrified of elephants in India in the 19th century. So Hannibal does an audacious thing. He puts his African elephants on barges, he ships them over to Spain, and he marches them through Europe and across the Alps and down into Rome, and actually comes within a day's march or so of the city of Rome, thinking the whole while that he is going to be supported by all of these city-states and little tribes that Rome has conquered. In the meantime, the Romans fight delaying tactics over and over again. They pick at him here, they bother him there, they won't come to a pitched battle. And the reason they won't come to a pitched battle is because Quintus Fabius Maximus Vercosus knows, usually called Fabian, knows that he cannot defeat them, and in fact that there is no general in the Roman army who is capable of fighting the way that Hannibal needs to be fought. And he is right. And in fact, at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, an army of about 87,000 Romans is utterly destroyed. About 10,000 of them are left, the rest of them are killed and captured. And at that point, Hannibal comes marching down toward Rome, thinking that, he's going to get support from the local conquered populations, and he's very wrong. And what we want to talk about in particular today is why those conquered populations, most of whom had only been ruled by the Romans for a generation or two, were so content with Roman rule that they didn't rise up to the promises that Carthage made. Now, part of it was that Carthage had a reputation for being very imperial, for being very cruel, and for absolutely taking everything that they could get and more from conquered peoples. And what was Rome's reputation? Rome's reputation was, we build roads. We hunt down bandits. We secure trade. Oh yes, we tax you and plenty, and don't evade the tax man. But the taxes won't change from year to year on a whim. And you can get justice in our courts that's the same justice for a citizen as it is for a non-citizen. In terms of the law is the same. The punishments might not be the same, but theft is theft, and murder is murder, and so on. And that's very important. And that is the foundation of what we call the Pax Romana that was so very important to the spread of early Christianity. Well, why do the Romans care about those things? Other than there seems to be this sort of national character to organize and to tidy up, if you will. One reason that they care about them, and we touched about this a little bit last week, is that there's a new thing in Rome that really had not appeared before this point, and that is a middle class. So jump back a minute to Greece. In Greece, you had people who were farmers and of lower class, and you had people who were of higher status. And they were often merchants and so on, but they were not a middle class per se. They still had a tie to the land, or they were still nobility. They were not a merchant class that was the only thing that defined them, was the fact that they were merchant class. Well, what happens in Rome is that because of this plebeian patrician split, the patricians eventually end up with these huge estates. And the plebeians work them. But there's a big gap in wealth for the most part. And what the patricians discover, sort of accidentally, and I wouldn't have thought about it this way, but we can see looking back, is that you have to have something between the very wealthy and something between the peasant who works the farm. Because somebody's got to bring in exports to take out imports. Somebody has to provide trade goods. Someone has to provide services that aren't services that you can provide in your own household with your own familia, your own group of servants and slaves and family members. And we have to remember that though the Romans themselves were not, we don't think of them as being great traders. They were extremely driven by trade because this is not terribly farmable. They were importing grain. They were importing olive oil, and they were exporting wine. They were importing a lot of the goods that people needed for everyday life. And because of that, it made sense to them after they built that first major road to Samnitis during the Samnite Wars. It made sense to them to build roads that went to their various trading ports. Here's Rome. And they built roads out from Rome in every direction. And they patrolled those roads so you could travel on those roads and know that you weren't going to get robbed. They put up taverna. They encouraged little villages to sprout up at natural stopping points. The roads were measured. They had mileposts. And you remember in Matthew when Jesus talks about someone asks you to go 1 mile with you, then go 2, and he's talking about the Roman mileposts, which still survive today. I've seen them in Yorkshire many years ago when I was in Great Britain up by Hadrian's Wall. And so the middle class in Rome, they don't own land, but they own shops, and they own houses, and they own property, and they control great amounts of wealth. And what they aren't doing, and we'll get to this when we talk about the army, probably next week, what they aren't doing is joining the army, which causes its own problems, because the army is led by patricians, but it's mostly staffed by farmers or farmers' sons. And they pay them because they're leaving their crops. But as land ownership becomes consolidated in the hands, and these large estates in the hands of rich landowners, you have fewer and fewer farmers' sons to be soldiers. And that's going to create its own problems down the road. So you have merchants. And so they're doing imports. They're doing exports. They're making goods that are for local sale. And very importantly, they are paying taxes. And in order for them to pay taxes, they need to engage in trade. And they need to engage in trade freely without having to worry about Carthage over here, or pirates in the Aegean, or bandits on the roads. And so the Romans have a very strong interest in keeping the peace in Europe and in making sure that their traders and their merchants can travel freely, because they need the tax dollars in order to build those roads and pay that army and beautify Rome, which is starting to develop into a real architectural beauty at this point. And part of that is that they have time for leisure pursuits. So, they start out at the beginning of the Republic in the 500s. They're there for survival. Everybody has to pitch in, everybody has to be part of the army. And then slowly, as they take in more territory, as their population grows, they start to have some space for pursuits that are not directly related to survival, either military or farming or so on. And one of the things that happens is that you get geographers. So Pythias decides, hey, I want to know what the world looks like because I've heard all of these stories, and there's some pretty fantastical ones out there, and he records them. And I want to know if they're true. And so he just hops the ship And he's like, okay, I'm going to Greece. And he goes and he writes about Greece. And then he goes over to Persia and he writes about Persia. And he sails all around. And he eventually hears about these crazy people who paint themselves blue and have wickerwork chariots and burn people alive. That's from Pythias. And so he ends up in Britain. And it's actually, you could say, because of Pythias, that Julius Caesar becomes interested in Britain, many 200 years later. And he dies in 285. So just before the Second Punic War. But because he's written about all of this area, Roman merchants are like, hey, we could do some business there. But we got to get there. And then they get there and they start doing trade and there starts to be a problem. And they're like, oh, whoa. Let's get the army in here. Let's get things cleaned up. And so they start pushing for an expanse of borders. And it's good to look at the economics because we tend to think of the Romans as going out and just conquering the world because they had this urge for conquest. But a big piece of it was the economic needs of the very densely populated area back here that needed to have things coming in. And in fact, we jump ahead just a little bit within this time period we're talking about, we will actually find that Gaius Sempronius Gracchus, one of the Gracchi that you read about at the very end of your selection this week, actually arranged for all Roman citizens, all people in Rome itself, to have subsidized wheat because they couldn't grow enough wheat in this area. So it had to be imported, and that got too expensive. And that's why, bread and circuses becomes a thing during the empire because they have to constantly be bringing in grain from other parts of the empire in order to feed their population. So they fight off Carthage once, kind of to a stalemate. Second Punic War comes along. Hannibal is brilliant. They have nobody brilliant. They manage to survive Hannibal. Basically, he gets within about a day's march of Rome. The other tribes in Italy are unwilling to abandon their alliances with Rome. It's just a change. Remember, during the Samnite War, what did they find out? Oh, we're going to fight Samnos. Now we've kind of fought them to a stalemate. Now we've got to go deal with Latium. Now we've got to go deal with the Etruscans because they were supposed to be our allies, except while we were busy fighting Samnos, they were doing other stuff. Okay, we've got them taken care of. Now we're going to go back to Samnos. Now we've got to deal with the tribes over here. But they had that, and they had it in such a way that the other people on the Italian peninsula were happy to be under Roman rule. So Hannibal gets this close. He's lost most of his elephants to the Alps, but he still had a few. And he realizes that there's no way he's going to be able to sustain this supply line. And this part, he can't just bring supplies directly from Carthage because the Roman Navy is sitting here. And so he's forced to retreat. And part of the reason that he's forced to retreat is that the folks back home are like, we can't figure out how we're going to supply you. So he retreats, and then we get this guy. Cato the Censor. And Cato the Censor now spends the next while, several decades, participating in the rule of Rome as the censor as he should, participating in debates in the Senate. And at the end of every debate, he says, Carthago delenda est. That is my opinion, and my further opinion is Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And between his constant reminding of the people that Carthage is going to be a problem until they have dealt with Carthage, and Scipio being willing to take a unique approach and not try and fight the Carthaginians out of Europe, but instead sail straight to Africa and besiege and destroy the city of Carthage. The Third Punic War has a very different outcome. And in fact, Carthage is destroyed. The city is razed to the ground is sown with salt, and Rome is now the undisputed mistress of the Mediterranean world, and now has the ability to rule any part of it, and promptly discovers that she cannot rule herself. And what happens is something that hadn't happened since the earliest days of the Republic. There's a need for reform. This is just a fact of the development of nations. When there is a great crisis, like a war, certain decisions will be made, certain actions will be taken. And at the end of the time, those actions and those decisions that fall out from them will have to be adjusted in some way. So you see that after the American Revolution, you see that after the Civil War, you see that after World War I and World War II, and you certainly see it after the Punic Wars. And one of the things that has happened is that estates have been consolidated. There are fewer farmers. There's a need for agrarian reform to get the land back into the hands of the people who are actually going to farm it. And so Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, one of the Gracchi, is a consul, and he is a consul, part of the Populatus Party, the Popular Party, Popularis, excuse me. A consul for the people, and he says, we've got to do something about this. We've got to put land back into the hands of the plebeians, and here are the ways that we should do it, and here's how we should do it. And he pushes through agrarian reform. And some land does, in fact, go back into the hands of the plebeians. And then, in a complete upset, he's assassinated. He knew there was a plot against him. He took refuge, and he was assassinated anyway. And this horrifies the people of Rome, because they have not had an assassination since the time of the kings. It just wasn't done. You remember we talked about how when the plebeians were trying to get power in the Senate, one of the things they did was they elected their own consuls and then surrounded them with their own bodies. Their consuls couldn't be killed. And out of that rose this idea that people who had been elected into power were not to be touched, that they were sacred in some way. But this problem over agrarian reform and the patricians wanting to keep hold of what they had, and the plebeians wanting to have more, gets so hot that the Gracchi, both of them actually, are assassinated in time